it's not the level of debt that we should be alarmed by. It's the cost of servicing it, what should worry us. And it is rising in Poland.
A rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this.
Welcome to Warsaw Wire, where we explore the forces shaping Poland's business and energy future, from green transition to the country's finances. I'm your host, Alicja Ptak, a senior editor at Notes from Poland, and today we are turning to one of the biggest stories in Poland's economy, the country's rapidly growing public debt. According to new Eurostat data, Poland has recorded in the second quarter the second fastest increase in public debt in the entire European Union, just behind Finland. And while the overall debt level is still below the EU average, the speed of the rise, combined with the record defense spending and political resistance to new taxes, has grabbed headlines. To help us unpack what's really behind these numbers and what might come next, I'm joined today by Aleksander Kieroński, an analyst at Polityka Insight think tank who closely follows fiscal and economic policy. Aleksander, thank you for joining us today and welcome to Warsaw Wire.
Thank you for your invitation. I'm very glad to be here today.
So I would want to start with a big picture. Can you outline for us a little bit where we are and how Poland has found itself in this place?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that we need to add some context to what public debt in Poland actually is. Because in Poland, we are faced with a problem that I would like to call a dual nature of Polish debt. So the data that you mentioned, the Eurostat data, is debt that is calculated using the methodology that is used in European Union. However, in Poland, we have other definition of Polish debt. So the national debt in Poland is defined by Public Finance Bill, and it's a closed catalog of entities that add up to public debt. This differs very much from what we report to the European Union and what European Union calculates actually, because we have a problem with so-called extra budgetary funds in Poland. So these are the funds that are set up in our National Development Bank, BGK, Bank Gospodarstwa Krajowego in Polish. And these do not add up to our Polish definition of debt.
Why is it so?
Funds that are in the that are set up in the Polish Development Bank, they are not included in the catalog that is in our Polish legislation. Let's say that the debt that Eurostat shows is around 60% of GDP for Poland.
58%
Yes.
point something, if I remember correctly.
Yes, and our debt that is calculated according to our Polish rules is only around 50% of GDP.
If I understand correctly, it is important because in the Polish constitution, Poland is not allowed to exceed 60% of that according to the national way of counting it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's where I was headed. That's actually why the extra budgetary funds were set up. Because during the pandemics, if if some funding wasn't set up, completely apart from the budget, then we would break our own national fiscal rules, and there would be consequences for politicians. So they do not want to do that. And however, this whole procedure started way back in 2010 because we were preparing for the Euros, for the tournament in football, and we had to spend a lot of money to build roads, to build hotels, to build infrastructure. So back then, we were also very close to breaking our own fiscal rules, and then the first extra budgetary fund was set up. And during the pandemics, the excessive use of those funds started, yeah, started to be excessive, as they said.
So it's, if I understand correctly, are you saying that basically right now the reality of the past few years, post-pandemic, post-COVID, started to catch up with Poland, and we start to feel the consequences of the choices that have been made in the past few years, right?
Yeah, that's completely right. Because what is important is that the cost of debt servicing is higher in terms of those extra budgetary funds.
So if I understand correctly, the national debt is cheaper because it is issued by the state, but the extra budgetary debt is more expensive because it's issued by some other entity, right?
It is issued directly by the National Development Bank, and they are responsible for handling the debt, for servicing it. And investors, they see it and they say, hey, okay, if you want to do this, you know, a bit around the clock, okay, but we want higher returns on our investment.
So let's come back to the debt expressed in the EU terms, because this is the figure that brought us here today.
Yes, and if I may add, this is the figure that I would like to be referring to today as much as possible, because that is the broadest picture of Polish debt that we have.
And it is a figure that includes both the budgetary debt and extra budgetary debt, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's why it's important to look at it. So I have to come clean with one thing. I started thinking about this story, about the story of Polish debt, when I was approached earlier this year, I think like in June, by a journalist, economic journalist from France. So she came to me and she said, oh, so there is an issue with public debt in Poland. Do you know anything about this? Like how serious it is? So I just had a quick look at the data and I was shocked that she was coming to me, to Poland, asking questions about how serious is Polish debt, given that the debt of France is already over, I think, like 110% or so. Poland's, it's 58%. And I think the EU average is around 82. So can you explain us, is the level of Polish debt really alarming?
Well, so yeah, at first, it is quite funny that it came from a French journalist, especially given their current problems with fiscal overall. However, um, yeah, so maybe I would start with that France's level of debt is way higher than Poland's because of the development stage that France is in and Poland is in. So France is a highly developed country, and they, let's say, can afford higher levels of debt. Poland is still a developing country. Or we are very close to being a developed country. Some international entities consider us as a developed country. However, that's still an ongoing process. But uh, Poland's Polish level of debt is not yet alarming in itself. So, in Europe and in fiscal rules overall, we are very attached to to this indicator. So, debt to GDP. Well, in terms of economics and a very broad literature about that, this indicator is flawed in its construction. However, I'm not going to maybe get into details because I would have to explain the different variables used in equations, etc. So let's leave it at that. If someone is interested, I would recommend some works of an economist, Fisher. So yeah, So that's one argument, that the indicator in itself is a bit flawed. Uh, However, what is certain that it's not the level of debt that we should be alarmed by, it's the cost of servicing it, what should worry us. And it is rising in Poland.
Compared to France, it's a lesser issue for them because I assume they have lower costs of servicing debt, right? Because they are in the Eurozone, etc.
Well, right now, their cost of servicing is a bit higher because their rating, their debt rating was cut recently. So yeah, they have other problems. But in Poland, the level is rising. And this indicator, so cost of servicing to GDP, is not flawed because those variables match. Uh, and this year, it is 1.9% of GDP. However, according to the forecast made recently by the Ministry of Finance, by 2029, it would rise to nearly 3%. And that's quite a high dynamic. And we should be concerned about it because it means that we have less and less space to refinance our debt because we are kind of going into a loophole that we are still buying more, we are issuing more debt to refinance the old debt, and this new debt is way is much more expensive than the old one. So we are kind of in a in a loop, and this is what's dangerous. This is what actually causes the crisis of public finance, not the debt level itself.
And can you tell us a little bit what Poland is doing to address this issue? Because as far as you just said, they just keep on refinancing the debt. So is there anything that they do to maybe avoid the crisis that you mentioned?
Let's start with what's the source of public debt in general. And this is the deficit, the deficit that countries have each year, basically. Having a surplus in a budget or basically in the public finance sector is quite extraordinary these times. Only Bulgaria in last few years, I believe, but they are very strict with their fiscal rules. So that's a very different topic. However, in Poland, we had for past few years, for actually at least 10 years, we had a growing deficit in the budget, and uh, at the same time, the growing deficit in the public finance sector. So this is what was the source of the debt.
Wasn't that in 2020, as we are entering 2020, the then government of Law and Justice planned the first ever in the history of modern Poland a budget without deficit. But the pandemic hit, and what? It turns out that our trajectory for our budget went completely the other way, right?
Yeah, it went completely the other way. In 2020, the deficit, it was supposed to be zero or even a slight surplus, and it was around 85 billion zloty. It wasn't meant to from the start because that was a very hard job to keep a surplus or a balanced budget, even back then, without the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, so yeah, the government had to issue a rescue package for the whole economy. And this is actually where our problems with deficit, with debt started. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, it was then when we started the excessive use of extra budgetary funding. And it was then when our deficit started to grow. There was a slight decline in the following years, However, then came the elections in 2023. And elections and fiscal policy, well, they kind of correlate because when there are elections, politicians like to spend more money. And this is what happened in 2023 and in 2024 and so on and so forth.
You say the one election, second election, and it was the fiscal policy was used in a way to help the governments that were in power at the time, so peace until 2023. And then the current ruling coalition also used this tool as well. Am I understanding correctly?
Yes, because the ruling party back then in 2023, so peace, law and justice. I don't know if it's if we translate that, but yeah, uh, they started to use fiscal to loosen up the fiscal policy before the elections. They did not win them in the end, and the new ruling coalition started fulfilling some of its promises made during the electoral campaign. So, for example, they gave a raise to the employees of the public sector, which which added to our deficit and in the end to public debt. And they also started with some new social programs that also added to the debt. And of course, let's address the elephant in the room. Our military need started to grow rapidly due to the war that is, well, right next to us in Ukraine. So in the end, we had to finance all that, and there was no other way than to finance it via issuing new debt. Because, of course, in in terms of like a purely economic theory, these new programs, these financing needs should have been financed via taxes increase or some other sources of revenue for the government. However, let's say raising taxes, it's quite not popular. It's definitely not popular with the society. They do not want higher taxes in Poland, especially in the current political climate. Taxes can only go down.
And they have been going down. At least the income tax, right, was decreased under peace, and the tax-free amount on revenue also was increased, meaning that less money were taxed.
Yes, and that's what added up to the deficit. And then the new ruling coalition introduced the reform of financing local governments, which also kind of added up to our budgetary deficit. However, the whole public finance sector was not hit by this particular reform.
So, if I understand correctly, both governments increased spending and decreased ways of gathering or venues to gather income.
Yeah, and right now the government has actually proposed some new sources of income. So, for example, they proposed that the excise duty will be on alcohol and cigarettes will raise higher than it was previously established in our Polish legislation. And what is more important, they propose a higher corporate income tax for banking sector. And the president, the newly elected president, Karol Nawrocki, is, well, to put it mildly, very skeptical about raising any taxes as he wants to fulfill on his promise to not raise or to not accept any rise in taxes at all. So, in the end, the government will probably have a very hard time in finding new sources of revenue if they want to meddle with the taxation system in Poland. However, what's important to notice is that the new sources of revenue that they proposed, that the president will probably not agree on, they are in the budget for the next year. So the revenue for the next year takes into account the new sources proposed by the Ministry of Finance, even though the ministry is not even sure if the president will agree on those new sources.
So it's a risky move on this part of the government,
Yeah.
but it kind of, I feel from my perspective, it kind of underlines this big tension right now that there is within between the government and the president, who are from the opposing sides of the political scene. Can you walk us through this a little bit? Because, as you said, Karol Nawrocki promised not to raise any taxes, and the question is, will he agree on the taxing the banks, which are not that popular also among the society, or things like, you said alcohol and things like that. So it looks like the government is at least trying to tax the things that would be socially acceptable. So the president doesn't want to increase taxes, the government doesn't want to decrease spending. So how do we keep our budget in check then?
So, in terms of decreasing spending, we actually managed to do that by a very low margin, because it's only, of course, it's a lot of money, but only to 3 billion zlotys year on year. So yeah, next year the spending is planned to be lower than this year. However, that's not enough to lower our deficit and to satisfy the fiscal rules that we have. We have to we have to follow European fiscal rules, and we have to satisfy them, and we have to satisfy the European Commission on fulfilling our promises. And we agreed on lowering our deficit to the level below 3% of GDP by 2028. So we have to find those new sources of revenue, or we have to decrease some spending. However, it's quite difficult to do because there is a lot of like fixed spending in the budget and in the public finance sector generally. For example, our social expenditure. We have this program 800 plus right now, and it's been going on since 2016. That that is kind of a social agreement between the government and the society. So uh, it is a universal spending program, which means that every family with at least one child gets 800 zloty monthly. And to deal and meddling with that, for example, trying to restrict some, I don't know, high income groups from getting from participating in this program would be considered as breaking the like, let's call it a deal between the government and the society. However, it would be actually quite beneficial for our economy and for our budget, because excluding the highest income households from the program would save us up to, well, roughly speaking, 20 billion zloty per year, which is a lot of money and which would definitely put a little bit of ease to the budget. However, as I said, it's probably a political suicide to do that. So the politicians will definitely not agree on any of that.
And if I remember correctly, before the elections in 2023, when the current coalition was trying to challenge peace, which introduced this child benefit, the peace told the society if they come to power, they will take the child benefit, they will take the 800 plus from you. So if I understand correctly, probably the Tusk government wouldn't be so keen on doing that, because in doing so, they would just prove peace correct.
Yeah, and that's a lost election in 2027, like straight away. So yeah, and speaking about from purely economic perspective, the only thing that government should be concerned with in terms of lowering our deficit, in terms of getting our debt under control, is not to increase the poverty rate, which is not that high in Poland right now. However, of course, the social expenditure aims to make it even lower. So that one thing that the government should be concerned about. And the second thing is that they should be, as I said, looking for some new sources of revenue. However, at the same time, not uh, putting a stop to our high growth rate of our GDP, of our economy, because that's the problem. That's the idea, that we want to somehow grow out of this debt. Polish economy is right now expanding quite rapidly. We are the fastest growing economy in the EU. Spain is doing quite all right recently. However, yeah, they have a very strong tourism sector, which we do not, sadly. But we have our other sources of growth. So we need to grow out of this debt. So when we reach a certain level of growth, then we would be able to deal with quite high level of debt, with quite high cost of servicing it, etc.
So this is what they hope for, right? But wouldn't it be like if you, in your own personal budget, would just hope that you will be able to pay on that, banking on your future pay rises without being sure that they will happen?
Yeah, that's exactly how it looks like. And however, it works more for the for the government and this, let's say, growing out of debt, because yeah, the economy to contract, it would need right now some devastating blow compared to the pandemics. So well, let's hope not, but war, for example, the escalation in Ukraine, right? So uh, this would this is what jeopardizes this plan of government. However, right now we are on a we are on a path that uh, this growing out of debt may work to some degree, of course, because doing only that, so counting on high growth rate, counting that our economy will not get hit by some external catastrophe. This is not enough. We have to manage our own public finances. And without doing so, well, we are driving towards the wall. And this wall will probably not be met by this government. However, I would argue that the next government will have a hard time if our politicians do not somehow come together and think about, okay, so what we can do to avert the crisis. And I'm not saying that the crisis is inevitable. However, if we do not manage the growing debt and we do not manage our deficits, the crisis may occur because at one point in time, the investors will say, okay, you are not responsible. We will not lend you any more money. And then that's where all the problems begin.
And what would you suggest to the current government how to approach this subject? What should they do to not to meet the wall?
Well, so as I was saying, they should be concerned the most about not increasing the poverty rate. So, for example, we have value added tax that and its rates differentiate between some goods and between some services, and for services the rates are usually lower in the value added tax. So maybe we should check this system, that the value added tax rates on services should be a little bit higher, especially because for lower income groups, services do not services are not as important in their consumption patterns. Uh, in lower income groups, it, eh, they consume more like a primary need goods. So, for example, food. This is what consists of their. This is what uh, builds their consumption the most. So, for as I said, VAT tax for services. Maybe this needs some update, or basically new rates for services. Uh, so politicians can also think of some new taxes in terms of and calling it the war tax. This is something that is ongoing in Poland in public debate, that we should introduce some new tax in order to finance our military spending. And this could take a form of, I don't know, for example, a tax for high income groups, or a tax or a sectoral tax for companies, for example, the banking sector, so that we kind of all raise money to finance our military spending and increase our safety. That's obvious. We can also adjust our social spending. So, social spending, as I said, it would break the deal between the government and the society. However, maybe this is the discussion that we should be ready for. Maybe this is the discussion that we should actually participate in Poland, because uh, these this spending is the most crucial one in terms of raising our deficits. However, maybe it's not as effective, economically speaking, as it should have been. Because, okay, 800 plus is universal. However, it was supposed to increase our birth rate in Poland. It was supposed to kind of nudge us into having more and more kids. However, after many years, after almost 10 years of program being in place, we already know that it doesn't work this way, that this program is mainly focused on reducing the poverty rate among children and among lower income households. So maybe we should start talking about that. There are many things that the government can do. However, they are quite hard to do because they are usually not politically popular among the society. And as you know, as we all know, politicians only have one goal and it is to win the elections. And the elections are coming up in Poland in 2027. So I think that this government will not be doing much in order to get our public finances in order. And the next government, whichever it may be, they will have a problem because, according to the latest forecasts of Ministry of Finance, we will be close to our constitutional limits in 2029. So 4 years from now, that's a completely different electoral cycle that we are talking about.
How confident are you that it wouldn't be too late to go back to the path of, let's say, more fiscal budgetary balance?
Yeah, so I am not entirely confident in the next government being able to quickly come back to balance. Um, oh, there is one thing that plays to the government, again, whichever it may be, advantage, and that is the structure of Polish debt. So most of it is uh, is issued here in Poland domestically and in Polish zloty. So national investors, our Polish investors, uh, do have a bit of higher tolerance for what the government does, for what the government plans to do, and how much debt it wants to issue in the following years. So that's it. The structure of debt is playing to our advantage. However, getting back to to fiscal balance, this will be hard because someone will have to raise taxes. Someone will have to cut some spending. Someone will have to decide how to finance our military spending. So this is what the next government will probably face. And well, it depends on how willing will they be to make politically unpopular decisions. And yeah, that's where I'm pessimistic, even though usually I'm optimistic about public finance.
We started this podcast with a story about Poland's growth miracle. We invited economist Marcin Piątkowski to tell our listeners about Poland's amazing growth over the past 3 decades. And I wonder, is that story putting this amazing growth at danger?
Well, it doesn't. I would say it doesn't. Because public spending adds up to our GDP. That's the equation that we're working with as economists. So uh, issuing debt doesn't necessarily jeopardize growth. Uh, when it becomes unserviceable, then when it becomes dangerous. And right now, the demand for Polish obligations, for Polish bonds, for Polish debt is quite high. Every auction that I observe almost every week, held by the Ministry of Finance, they issue, let's say, 10 billion zloty in bonds, and the investors say, okay, but we were ready to buy 17 billion. So yeah, the demand is there. And this is something that we are not worried about, at least yet. So yeah, I wouldn't say that this debt story is dangerous for our growth. However, our model of growth that we had over past 30 or and more years is actually kind of expiring because we highly rely our investment cycle highly relies on inflow of EU funds, and we will not have the inflow of EU funds forever. So we have to somehow revitalize the private investment in our economy. We have to get the private capital to start working in Polish economy in order to maintain the growth that we are observing right now.
To wrap up, what would you say to my colleague from France? Is the Polish debt story the story to watch in Europe?
Well, it is the story to watch in Europe, definitely, because the Polish economy is a very, very interesting one to observe. Because, as you mentioned, there's the story of our growth miracle. There is the story of our political tensions, which are also quite interesting to observe. And there is a story of debt, which is interesting in terms of seeing how it develops. So, because that's a test for politicians, basically, to see how they may manage the situation that is not yet dangerous. However, in, let's say, a perspective of 5-10 years, it may become dangerous for the economy as a whole. So, yeah, I would say yes, keep observing Poland. However, we will be observing France.
That was Aleksander Kieroński from Polityka Insight, helping us to make sense of Poland's fast-changing fiscal landscape and where defense, politics, EU discipline intersect. Aleksander, thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, subscribe. And see you in the next episode.